Hi, I'm Dr. Lou Pulsfer, and I'm going to talk about a common problem in video games. And that is that the content of the game is expensive to produce and is getting more expensive to produce. Yet in most video games, which are essentially puzzles in this respect, the creators of the game have to provide all the content, everything the players can possibly do. Now, when computers were very limited in their processing power, this was not a problem. Back in old Atari days, one person could provide all the content, the programming, the graphics such as they were, the sound such as it was, and so forth. But in the 3D computer age, the content is much more expensive to produce. Typically, in a big modern game, more artists than non-artists are working on the game. And this is why games are getting shorter. Even as AAA games have increased in price, they get shorter because the 3D content just costs too much. At the same time, many players have come to like open world games where there's lots of possibilities and different paths that you can follow, as opposed to linear games with strictly limited possibilities. So some of the content is not used because the player takes a different path. So you need even more content compared to the minutes of actual play. Add to that, everything is getting more complicated because now we have online play and multiplayer play. It's not just single player games anymore. Now, it's different in games with human opposition. If you have a game with human opposition, such as a tabletop game, the opponent provides much of the content, quote unquote. Humans are experts. They're unpredictable, they're fascinating in ways a computer cannot be. And yet they provide opportunities for yomi, for reading the opponent's intentions, that computers cannot provide because they're too predictable. And of course humans have, if you're playing face-to-face, or if you can see the person on the screen or something like that, or talk to them, they give more clues than the computer is going to give to their intentions. And this human opposition is why somebody can play a tabletop game hundreds of times and yet still see new things and learn new things. Let's look at RPGs a minute, role-playing games. Much of video gaming derives from Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop games. You can think of many things like levels and character advancement and so on. I've listed more here on the slide. In the RPG, there's human-controlled opposition, but it's a cooperative game. The referee is neutral or probably slightly pro-player. But it's a cooperative game, and co-op, of course, is becoming more and more popular in all kinds of games, not just video games. So, what's one solution to the video game content problem? It's to use human opposition to provide the content. Now we have an example of this, EVE Online, a massively multiplayer online game that's been going for more than a decade. Every player is an independent potential ally or enemy. If you go mining outside the worlds that are well patrolled by the police, then some other player can come and raid you and destroy your ship and so on. The players tend to form corporations or guilds, and the guilds tend to form alliances, and those larger entities fight, somewhat like earthbound nations have wars. So what happens in EVE is very much depends on humans, and the stories that you get from EVE Online, I don't play myself, are quite fascinating. And it's because it's humans, not computers, providing the opposition. Similarly, when video game players play as a team, in your typical multiplayer game, you have two teams and they fight each other, but there is a human element in the opposition. Think Team Fortress, Call of Duty, etc. It's usually not a very organized opposition, but nonetheless, it's human opposition. Then you get to MOBAs, which I believe stands for Massively Online Battle Arena. League of Legends, Defense of the Ancients 2, There are others coming. The origination of all this was Defense of the Ancients, which was a Warcraft 3 mod. The only way to play these games is in teams of 5 against other humans. World of Tanks isn't a MOBA, but it uses the same kind of team play, 15 versus 15, in mostly random arrangements. You can get a platoon of 3 together, but the other 12 tanks on your team are going to be randomly determined. So, you are fighting other humans, and you can have all the fascination of fighting other humans who are much better generally than computer opposition. Take something like Clan vs. Clan, which is a mobile game, but more or less an RTS that pits players against other players. These are all free-to-play games, and they're some of the most profitable games today. And part of the reason they're profitable is they don't have to provide massive amounts of content and keep adding to that content in order to keep players playing. The humans provide the content, in effect. There's a variation of this where non-human or non-developer humans create the content, such as new levels or scenarios or puzzles. Little Big Planet for the PS3 was one of the early games of this type, but new scenarios for Civilization, new levels for Unreal Tournament. The deluxe version of Unreal Tournament not only provided the level editor, but 10 or 15 hours of tutorials on how to use it. Mods of games in general are ways for humans other than the developers to create content, which doesn't cost the developers, the studio, the publisher any money. Another method of avoiding having to have the developers create more and more content is procedural generation. The computer generates the new content, the new areas of play. Those who played old-time Dungeons & Dragons know you could use the tables in the Dungeon Master's Guide to generate dungeons and monsters and magic items. That's procedural generation. You roll dice and see what you get. Roguelike games have rebounded in popularity, in part because they procedurally generate the content. Now the problem with this is that it can make it very hard on the player. There are a lot of times when this procedural generation results in a very, very difficult situation where it's really hard to succeed. Now let's look at MMOs. The typical MMO, the content is created by the developers, and that's why MMOs are the most expensive kind of video game, because a vast amount of content has to be created. Even then, some players shoot through all the content very rapidly and then they quit. And that has killed the subscription basis because you can't keep the subscribers. So now most MMOs are free to play. EVE is an exception because it offers more because of that human opposition. Now some MMOs are going to use procedurally generated content. Here's the problem with MMOs. Typically an MMO is a free-to-play environment. People who play free-to-play games are expecting to be continually rewarded. Procedurally generated content can often be quite hard to play content. And in MMOs, a player challenged is a player lost. So will the players quit when they run up against this hard content? So here's my conclusion: to reduce the spiraling costs of producing big video games, provide human opposition, whether it's via the EVE model or PvP, player versus player, or team multiplayer, or something like a MOBA, and use procedurally generated content, and let the human players generate new content. This is the way to reduce the costs of video games.